If your child just sat the HAST or Edutest for a transfer into a selective high school, here's the thing I think almost nobody tells families going into this. The next few weeks of silence do not mean anything has gone wrong. I say this every single intake period, every single year to parents who come to me convinced that because they haven't heard anything in a week or two, their child has already missed out and they didn't make it in. And in my experience, that assumption is wrong more often than it is correct. I want to actually walk through what happens after the exam itself because I don't think anyone really explains this part properly. And going in blind is, I think, one of the most stressful parts of the whole process for families. For anyone who's newer to the channel, my name is John and I'm the founder of Bing's Academy. We've been doing one-on-one tutoring for Selective, HAST, OC for over 10 years now, and I've actually went through this exact process myself, specifically for the HAST exam. I transferred from Penrith Selective High School into Girraween High School, but it took me 3 attempts before it actually worked and I made it in for Year 11 entry, which is my final time. So I've been on the other side of this exact waiting period as students multiple times, not just as someone coaching families and students through it now. Before I go any further, I want to be very clear about exactly which process I'm talking about here, because I think this gets mixed up a lot. Everything I'm about to walk through applies to the transfer process from years 8 through to year 11 school entry. After missing the original year 7 entry or going into a school and you want to get into a better one. It's generally a different process to the one in year 7, which is run by the Department of Education and decided purely on the exam sat in May. There's no interview stage, no documentation review. The school doesn't decide, so the way that I'm about to describe it. The transfer process is not one single exam as well. Some schools use HAST, some schools use Edutest, and some have their own custom exam entirely, Normanhurst and Sydney Boys being the 2 examples. But everything we're about to walk through, the interview, the documentation check, the reserve list, applies broadly across all of them, regardless of which exam a specific school uses. So let's actually go through the sequence, because I think once you see the shape of it, a lot of the anxiety in that gap starts to make a lot more sense. The exam itself is really only the first input into a much longer process, not the end of it. Schools aren't sitting there marking papers and sending out a yes or a no that very same day. It's done on a Saturday. What actually tends to happen is that shortlisted students get contacted directly by the school, usually by text, phone call, or email to arrange an interview. If they're good enough, they might actually get an offer straight out. And I think this is the point that trips up a lot of families because getting that call is really good news and it feels like really good news, but the school's still actively considering your child more often than not. It isn't a straight up offer, and I don't want anyone walking away from that call assuming the decision has basically already been made unless it was actually being made. And here's where it gets, I think, genuinely underexplained. If a student isn't successful, every school they actually apply to will let them know individually. That's not something that only comes from one single place. What is specific to the highest preference school is that the test result, the actual score, if that applies in terms of the placement, generally that's the only place you'll receive it from, either by mail or physically in the post. But none of that, successful or not, comes the moment a decision is made about your child specifically. It comes after interviews and offers across the entire process has already been finalized. So schools aren't working through applications one at a time and getting back to each family as they go. The whole thing runs on its own timeline as a batch. And that's really the source of most of the waiting. If you've listed more than one school down as a preference, it's also worth keeping in mind that each school is running its own process independently of the others. So it's generally impossible to hear from one school before another, and on its own, that doesn't tell you anything about how the rest are going. I've had families read a lot into which schools calls first or which school hasn't called, and honestly, I don't think there's much to read into at all. It's just a reflection of where that particular school happens to be in its own timeline. I know it could feel like a strange way to run things. Everyone wants an answer, a decision as quickly as possible, and I understand that. But when you actually think about it from the school's point of view, they're trying to work out the entire cohort at once in terms of who's successful and who's not, and then rank them accordingly. not just saying yes or no to one applicant. And then once you've said no to someone, it's very awkward to come back and say, hey, do you want to reconsider? It's less like a queue where everyone gets served one at a time, and more like the whole picture needs to come together before anyone's told anything final. It is frustrating if you're the one waiting, and I'm not pretending otherwise, but it's not arbitrary and it's not personal. Every school runs this process the same broad shape, but each one runs it entirely on its own. They don't have visibility into what's happening with the school's other application, and they don't know whether another school has already made an offer. That doesn't stop them, however, from asking about this directly in the interview itself though. If you're in an interview, it's a generally common question. What other schools have you applied to? And in terms of the school that you're actually being interviewed for, where does that sit on your list? The interview itself matters more than people expect going in. I think of one student in particular, strong reports across the board, a strong exam result too. In HAST, everything on paper pointing to an offer, but in the interview, the student was quiet, they were hesitant, they were very nervous, given the high stakes, of course, and that alone was enough to just put them on the reserve list, and they ended up not getting an offer. But if they did very well, perhaps they would have gotten an offer straight up. It works the other way too. I've had a student walk in, they didn't have the strongest documentation and the strongest reports, but in that interview, they got an offer right afterwards because they spoke with clarity and confidence. They could explain why the report was a little bit weaker and what their plans were. Some schools run these online now too, but more often than not, it is in person, and it's not unusual to be sitting across the principal or the deputy principal more than just the normal teacher or a staff member. One practical thing worth doing beforehand is bring the same documentation you originally submitted. The reports, the extracurricular record, all of it, because schools will actually check it against what is being sent in. So it needs to be accurate and consistent, not just bringing in random things that you didn't even submit the first time. If your child gets the core, that is a good sign. If your child hasn't gone the core yet, it's not automatically a bad sign. It might just mean that the school hasn't reached that part of the process yet, but it is a bit of a warning symbol, because if they're organizing interviews with everyone else and not you at that same school, then that could be a bit iffy. So that's something to really factor in about. What is also important is that if there hasn't been a call or a message by about mid-September, that's usually when I'll actually start adjusting my expectations. Though I want to hedge that it can change fairly heavily. It shifts year to year and school to school. And I don't have visibility into every school's exact internal process or internal timeline. What I don't want anyone to expect is reading meaning into the early weeks specifically. That stretch isn't evidence either way. It's just how long the process generally takes. That changes once you're well past the normal window for that particular school. And at that point, it's worth reaching out directly rather than continue to guess. There's one more piece of this that I think matters a lot and doesn't get talked about enough, which is the reserve list. Not every strong candidate gets an immediate offer, so some students get placed on a reserve list instead, which basically means that there's still a hope for them to get an offer and they're in the running, just behind students who are offered a place first, or if there was any spots available in the first place. So you are the backup. And this is actually where supporting documentation, school reports, extracurricular attendance, NAPLAN, all of that plays an outsized role, because when a school decides on who moves off the reserve list and who does it, they're looking at the supporting documentation to differentiate these students. Also, the same thing is which student is reserve number 1 compared to reserve number 10. This is where the supporting documentation plays a major part. I've gone through what the documentation should look like a lot more in depth in a guide on our website in a previous video. So if you want to go through that properly, it's linked down below with the quiz that kind of gives you a quick snapshot too. I think the honest takeaway here, and probably the thing I actually want a family to do with these next few weeks, rather than just refresh the email or call the school every hour, is to use the time productively. You don't want to be that annoying person. Instead of just anxiously waiting. The waiting period can be uncomfortable, and I understand that completely, but it's not a period where there's nothing left to do. Practically, what I actually suggest is very simple. Keep going to school normally. Don't let this become the only thing your child hears about at home for the next month or two, because that pressure doesn't help anyone. The stress is something that you can't actually change for this particular year. It's already done. nothing can be changed the outcome anyway. But if there's a next report period coming up before anything's confirmed, that report still matters. Whether this particular application succeeds or not, since a reserve list decision or a future attempt further down the line will be exactly what you're looking for in great practice for the future. And if your child does get called in for an interview, that's a really positive sign worth being excited about, even while you're holding off on calling it a done deal until they get the offer in hand from the school. One more thing worth knowing about is how this particular attempt goes. Unless your child is currently in year 10, this doesn't have to be the only shot worth preparing for. The transfer process runs across years 8 to 11 entry for quite a lot of these selective schools. So it's worth treating next year's attempt, but the exam side and the supporting documentation side are something you can keep building on. Don't just wait and twiddle your thumbs. You can still work on it, sign up to an extracurricular, work on your school report, because if it doesn't work out this year, you can try out for next year, unless you're in year 10. I'm actually saying this from my own personal experience, going through it 3 times myself. If I stopped preparing after one attempt and only started again once the result had actually come in and the outcome had come in, I don't think I would have made it in at all. Waiting until October or November after the result lands to start preparing for the next attempt is wasting months. I could start preparing in September, and I don't know why anyone would consider just choosing to not just get a head start, prepare for the following year, whether or not you actually make it in, or work on the documentation side. I remember certain sections of the HAST exam being very difficult for me personally. Maybe it's maths, maybe it's reading, and that's not something you can close in just a few weeks or a few months. It takes actual runway. If your child's in year 10 right now, I want to flag something specifically because it does change the calculation. Year 12 starts next year for them. Year 11's only 3 terms. So rather than 4 before senior study begins, if they're in year 10, they shouldn't twiddle their thumbs either. Yes, they can't try out again next year, but year 12 is next year and the stakes are high. So it is going to be very important for them to prepare for that accordingly as well. But if you enjoyed this video, let me know down in the comments below. And if you want me to go through anything else on this topic, on a different topic, like what to say in the interviews, I actually break down all the interviews and the questions to our students that do tutoring with us. So I can't share everything like that, but I can go through the gist so you know what to expect. Like the video if you haven't already, comment. It does mean a big difference. I try to reply to everything, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.